She still remembers the exact moment her heart broke. It was a Tuesday afternoon in late November, and the sky outside the conservatory windows was the color of ash. She had been waiting for this day for 3 years. 3 long years of saving every penny, working double shifts, skipping meals, all for one chance to learn from the best pianist in the country. Her name was Lucia, and she was 24 years old. She had grown up in a small apartment on the east side of the city, the kind of place where the walls were thin and the radiator never worked properly in winter. Her family didn't have much. Her father had left when she was young, and her mother worked 2 jobs just to keep food on the table. But there was one thing they had that money couldn't buy. They had her grandmother. Her grandmother had been a pianist back in her home country before she immigrated. She never became famous. She never played in big concert halls or wore fancy dresses on stage. But when she sat down at the piano, something magical happened. The whole room would go quiet. Even the neighbors would stop arguing through the walls just to listen. When Lucia was 5 years old, her grandmother placed her tiny hands on the keys of their old upright piano. It was a beaten-up instrument that someone had thrown away, and her grandmother had spent weeks fixing it herself. Half the keys stuck, and it was never quite in tune. But to Lucia, it was the most beautiful thing in the world. Every single day after school, her grandmother would teach her. They couldn't afford sheet music, so her grandmother wrote the notes by hand on lined paper. They couldn't afford a metronome, so her grandmother would tap her foot and count out loud. They couldn't afford proper lessons, so her grandmother taught her everything she knew, passing down secrets that had been shared with her by her own teacher decades ago. Those afternoons at the piano were the happiest moments of Lucia's childhood. Her grandmother would make hot chocolate, and they would sit together on the creaky bench, their shoulders touching, filling that tiny apartment with music. Her grandmother used to say that the piano was like a friend who would never leave you. No matter how hard life got, no matter how much you lost, the music would always be there. When Lucia was 17, her grandmother passed away. It happened quietly, in her sleep, on a cold January night. Lucia found her the next morning, still and peaceful. Her hands folded over her chest. On the nightstand was a note written in shaky handwriting. It said simply, "Never stop playing, my darling. Your music will take you places I could only dream of." After that, Lucia almost gave up the piano entirely. Every time she touched the keys, she thought of her grandmother, and the grief was too heavy to bear. But slowly, over time, she began to play again. Not because she wanted to, but because she felt she owed it to the woman who had believed in her more than anyone else in the world. For years, Lucia played in secret. She was too shy to perform in public, too afraid of what people might think. She worked at a laundromat during the day, folding other people's clothes and watching the hours crawl by. At night, she would go home to her tiny studio apartment and practice on a cheap electronic keyboard she had bought at a pawn shop. The keys were plastic, and the sound was nothing like a real piano. But it was all she could afford. Then one day, she saw the flyer. It was taped to the window of a coffee shop, flapping in the wind. Master pianist Vincent Ashford was coming to the city to teach a one-day masterclass. It was a rare opportunity. The flyer said, only 20 students would be selected. The cost was $500. $500. That was more than Lucia made in 2 weeks. But something inside her stirred. She thought of her grandmother, of the note on the nightstand, of all those afternoons spent learning music on a broken piano. She thought of everything she had given up and everything she had never tried. She started saving that very day. She picked up extra shifts. She stopped buying coffee. She ate rice and beans for dinner every single night. When her shoes wore out, she taped them together instead of buying new ones. Month after month, she put every spare dollar into an envelope hidden under her mattress. 3 years later, she finally had enough. The day of the masterclass, Lucia woke up before dawn. She spent an hour deciding what to wear, finally settling on a simple black dress she had found at a thrift store. It had a small tear near the hem, but she hoped no one would notice. She did her hair in a neat bun, the way her grandmother used to wear hers. She looked at herself in the mirror and took a deep breath. The conservatory was the most beautiful building she had ever seen. It had tall marble columns and gleaming wooden floors and chandeliers that sparkled like diamonds. The other students were already there when she arrived, milling around in expensive clothes, chatting casually about their teachers in Paris and their summer programs in Vienna. They all seemed to know each other. They all seemed to belong. Lucia stood alone in the corner, clutching her sheet music to her chest. She had copied the notes by hand because she couldn't afford to buy the official version. Her hands were trembling. Vincent Ashford entered the room, and everyone fell silent. He was tall and elegant, with silver hair swept back from his forehead and a perfectly tailored suit. He moved like someone who had never doubted himself a day in his life. When he spoke, his voice was smooth and confident. One by one, he called the students to the piano. They played beautifully, their fingers dancing across the keys with precision and grace. Vincent nodded approvingly, offering gentle corrections here and there. The other students watched with admiration. Then he called her name. Lucia's legs felt like they were made of water as she walked to the piano. She could feel everyone's eyes on her. She sat down on the bench and placed her trembling hands on the keys. She was going to play Chopin, the same piece her grandmother had taught her all those years ago. She began to play. For the first few bars, everything was fine. The notes came out clear and true, just the way she had practiced them 1,000 times in her tiny apartment. She started to relax. Maybe this would be okay. Maybe she actually belonged here. Then Vincent raised his hand. "Stop," he said. Lucia's fingers froze. The room went completely silent. Vincent tilted his head, studying her with an expression she couldn't quite read. Then, slowly, a smile spread across his face. But it wasn't a kind smile. It was the smile of someone who had just heard a joke. He laughed. It wasn't a loud laugh or a cruel laugh. It was worse than that. It was a dismissive laugh. The kind of laugh you give when something is so far beneath you that it barely deserves your attention. "Who let you in here?" he asked, still chuckling. "You play like someone taught you in a garage." The room erupted in muffled laughter. Lucia felt the blood drain from her face. Her vision blurred. She wanted to disappear, to sink through the floor, and never come back. Vincent had already moved on. He was gesturing for the next student to come forward, as if Lucia was nothing more than a minor interruption in his day. She gathered her sheet music with shaking hands. The pages were crumpled now, stained with sweat from her palms. She stood up from the bench and walked toward the door, her head down, her cheeks burning with shame. No one said a word to her. No one tried to stop her. She was invisible. When she finally reached her car in the parking lot, she sat behind the wheel and sobbed. She cried for her grandmother, who had believed in her so much. She cried for all the years of saving, all the sacrifices, all the hope she had carried to this place only to have it crushed in 30 seconds. She cried for the little girl who had once sat on a creaky piano bench, dreaming of something bigger. Vincent Ashford's laugh echoed in her mind, over and over again. She sat in that car for 3 hours, watching the sun set behind the conservatory. And in that moment, broken and humiliated, she made a decision that would change everything. She was not going to let this be the end of her story. That night, Lucia almost gave up everything. She went home to her tiny apartment, sat on the edge of her bed, and stared at the keyboard in the corner. The plastic keys seemed to mock her. What was the point anymore? Vincent Ashford was right. She was nobody. She played like someone who learned in a garage. She didn't belong in that world. And she never would. She picked up the keyboard and carried it to the door. She was going to throw it away. She was going to forget about music forever, and just accept that some dreams were not meant for people like her. People without money, people without connections, people who learned piano from their grandmothers in cramped apartments, instead of from famous teachers in fancy conservatories. But as her hand touched the doorknob, something stopped her. She looked down at her fingers. They were rough and calloused from years of folding laundry. But they were also her grandmother's fingers. The same shape, the same reach. She remembered how her grandmother used to hold her hands and say, "These hands were made for music, my darling. Don't ever let anyone tell you different." Tao. Tao. Tell, 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 tell. Lucia set the keyboard back down. She sat on the floor, her back against the wall, and she cried again. But this time, the tears felt different. They weren't just tears of sadness, they were tears of anger too. Anger at Vincent Ashford for laughing at her. Anger at all those students who had joined in. Anger at a world that seemed designed to keep people like her out. And somewhere in that anger, she found something else. She found fire. When she woke up the next morning, her eyes were swollen, and her body was exhausted. But her mind was clear. She was not going to quit. She was not going to let one man's laughter erase everything her grandmother had given her. If the classical music world didn't want her, she would force them to notice her. She would become so good that they couldn't ignore her anymore. The problem was, she had no idea how. She couldn't afford lessons. She couldn't afford a real piano. She couldn't even afford proper sheet music. All she had was her cheap keyboard, an internet connection, and a stubborn refusal to give up. So she did the only thing she could do. She taught herself. Every night after work, Lucia came home and watched videos of the greatest pianists in history. She studied their hands, their posture, the way they breathed, the way they moved. She slowed down recordings and played them frame by frame, trying to understand what made them so special. She read articles and interviews and anything she could find about piano technique. She filled notebooks with observations and questions and ideas. Then she would practice. Hour after hour, night after night, until her fingers ached and her eyes could barely stay open. Her keyboard had several broken keys that didn't make any sound, so she put small pieces of tape on them. That way, she could still feel the movements, even if she couldn't hear the notes. It wasn't perfect, but it was all she had. Months passed, then a year, then 2 years. Lucia's playing improved, but she knew something was still missing. She had watched thousands of hours of performances, and she had noticed something important. The pianists who truly moved people weren't just technically perfect. There was something else in their playing. Something deeper. It was like they were telling a story with every note. They weren't just hitting keys. They were sharing a piece of their soul. Lucia realized that she had been so focused on copying other people's techniques that she had forgotten to bring her own story to the music. She had been trying to sound like everyone else instead of sounding like herself. So she changed her approach. Instead of playing pieces exactly the way they were supposed to be played, she started experimenting. She played slower where it felt right to go slow. She added pauses where she needed to breathe. She thought about her grandmother while she played. And she let those memories flow through her fingers into the keys. Something shifted. The music started to feel alive. But practicing alone in her apartment wasn't enough. She needed to play for real people. She needed to know if what she felt inside was actually reaching anyone else. One cold Sunday morning, Lucia packed up her keyboard and took the subway downtown. She found a spot near the entrance of a busy station, set up her instrument, and placed an empty coffee cup on the ground in front of her. Her heart was pounding. She had never played in public before. What if people laughed at her again? What if everyone just walked by like she wasn't even there? She closed her eyes, took a deep breath, and began to play. At first, people did walk by. They rushed past with their headphones in and their eyes on their phones, not even glancing in her direction. Lucia felt the old fear creeping back. Maybe this was a mistake. Maybe she should just pack up and go home. But she kept playing. She played the piece her grandmother had taught her, the one Vincent Ashford had stopped after 30 seconds. This time, no one was going to stop her. Slowly, something started to happen. One person paused. Then another. A woman pushing a stroller stopped and listened for a full minute. An old man sat down on a nearby bench and closed his eyes. A little boy tugged on his mother's hand and pointed at the piano lady. When Lucia finished the piece, there was a moment of silence. Then, softly, people began to clap. The old man opened his eyes, and she saw that they were wet with tears. He reached into his pocket, pulled out a $5 bill, and placed it gently in her coffee cup. "That was beautiful," he said quietly. "It reminded me of my wife." Lucia couldn't speak. She just nodded, her throat tight with emotion. In that moment, she understood something important. Music wasn't about impressing people with perfect technique. It was about connection. It was about making someone feel less alone in the world, even if just for a few minutes. From that day on, Lucia played everywhere she could. She played in subway stations and on street corners. She played at nursing homes for elderly residents who had no one else to visit them. She played at small churches that couldn't afford to pay her but offered her coffee and gratitude instead. She wasn't making much money. Some days, she barely earned enough to cover her subway fare. But something was happening that was worth more than money. She was finding her voice. People began to recognize her. Regulars at the subway station would stop and chat with her before she started playing. The nurses at the nursing home would request her favorite songs. A small community was forming around her music, people who didn't care about her lack of formal training or her second-hand clothes. They just cared about how her playing made them feel. One evening, a young woman approached her after a performance at the nursing home. She was holding up her phone. "I recorded you playing," she said. "I hope that's okay. It was just so beautiful, and I wanted to show my mom." Lucia smiled and said it was fine. She didn't think much of it at the time. A week later, she woke up to find her phone flooded with notifications. The video had been posted online, and it had gone viral. 12 million views in 7 days. Strangers from all over the world were leaving comments, sharing their own stories, saying that her music had made them cry or reminded them of someone they had lost. Lucia sat in her tiny apartment, scrolling through the messages with trembling hands. She couldn't believe it. After all these years, after all the struggle and sacrifice and self-doubt, people were finally hearing her. And somewhere out there, Vincent Ashford was about to hear her too. For the first few days after the video went viral, Lucia thought it was some kind of mistake. She kept refreshing the page, watching the numbers climb higher and higher, convinced that at any moment it would all disappear. 12 million views, then 15 million, then 20. People from countries she had never heard of were commenting in languages she couldn't read. News websites started writing articles about her. They called her the subway pianist, the self-taught sensation, the woman who made the internet cry. Her phone rang constantly. Reporters wanted interviews. Producers wanted her on their morning shows. Strangers sent her messages asking for advice, for hope, for proof that ordinary people could still achieve extraordinary things. Lucia didn't know how to handle any of it. She was still working at the laundromat, still living in her tiny apartment, still practicing on her broken keyboard. Nothing about her daily life had changed. But suddenly, the whole world seemed to know her name. Then one afternoon, she received an email that changed everything. The message was short and simple. It said, "I watched your video 17 times. You have something rare. I would like to meet you. Please call me when you have a moment." It was signed Helena Reyes. Lucia read the name 3 times before she understood what she was looking at. Helena Reyes was a legend. She had been one of the greatest pianists of her generation, famous for performances that left audiences speechless. Critics had called her playing transcendent, otherworldly, once in a lifetime. Then, 15 years ago, a car accident had damaged the nerves in her right hand, and she had never performed publicly again. She had disappeared from the music world entirely, and now she was reaching out to Lucia. For 2 days, Lucia was too nervous to call. She must have picked up her phone 100 times, started dialing, and then stopped. What would she even say? What could someone like Helena Reyes possibly want with someone like her? Finally, on the 3rd day, she forced herself to make the call. Helena answered on the 2nd ring. Her voice was warm and direct, with just a hint of an accent that Lucia couldn't quite place. She didn't waste time with small talk. "I'm going to be honest with you," Helena said. "Your technique needs work. Your posture is wrong. Your fingering is inefficient." Any conservatory professor would have a list of criticisms, a mile long. Lucia's heart sank. Here it comes, she thought. Another person telling her she wasn't good enough. But then Helena continued. "And none of that matters," she said. "Because when you play, something happens. I felt it through a computer screen. I felt it in my chest. You have the thing that cannot be taught. The thing that most pianists spend their entire lives searching for and never find. You have soul. Lucia couldn't speak. Her eyes were filling with tears. I stopped teaching years ago, Helena went on. After my accident, I thought I had nothing left to give. But watching you play made me realize I was wrong. I still have knowledge. I still have experience. And I would like to share it with you, if you're willing to learn. I can't afford lessons, Lucia managed to say, her voice barely above a whisper. I don't have any money. Helena laughed softly. I'm not asking for money. I'm asking for your time and your trust. Come to my home this Saturday. We'll see if we're a good fit. That Saturday, Lucia took 3 buses to reach Helena's house on the outskirts of the city. It was a modest place. Nothing like the mansions she had imagined famous musicians living in. There were flowers in the front yard and wind chimes on the porch. It felt like someone's grandmother lived there. Helena greeted her at the door with a cup of tea and led her to a small room at the back of the house. In the center of the room sat the most beautiful piano Lucia had ever seen. It was a grand piano, polished and gleaming, clearly loved and well cared for. This was my instrument, Helena said quietly. I haven't played it in 15 years, but I keep it tuned. I keep it ready. She looked at Lucia with steady eyes. Sit down. Play something for me. Lucia sat at the bench. The keys felt different from anything she had ever touched before. They were smooth and perfectly weighted, responding to the slightest pressure. She played the same piece she always played, the one her grandmother had taught her. When she finished, Helena was silent for a long moment. Then, she nodded slowly. We have a lot of work to do, she said. But I think we can do something special together. For the next 8 months, Lucia visited Helena 3 times a week. She still worked at the laundromat during the day, but every spare moment was spent learning. Helena was a demanding teacher. She noticed every mistake, every moment of hesitation, every place where Lucia was holding back. But she was also patient and kind, and she never made Lucia feel stupid or small. Unlike Vincent Ashford, Helena didn't try to change who Lucia was. She didn't want to turn her into a copy of some classical ideal. Instead, she helped Lucia understand her own strengths and build on them. She taught her how to control her emotions without losing them, how to channel her story through her fingers with precision and power. Your grandmother taught you to play from the heart, Helena told her one evening. That is your gift. My job is to give you the tools to share that gift with the world. Slowly, Lucia's playing transformed. The raw emotion was still there, but now, it was focused, intentional, devastating. When she played, it was like watching someone open a window into their soul. Helena also taught her things that had nothing to do with music. She taught her how to walk onto a stage with confidence. She taught her how to handle criticism without letting it destroy her. She taught her that being nervous was normal, and that even the greatest performers in history had felt fear before stepping into the spotlight. The difference between amateurs and professionals is not talent, Helena said. It's what you do with your fear. Amateurs let it stop them. Professionals let it fuel them. As Lucia improved, word began to spread through the classical music community. People who had seen her viral video started paying closer attention. She was invited to perform at a small festival in Europe, then at a concert series in South America. Critics who had dismissed her as a gimmick started changing their minds. One review said she was a breath of fresh air in a stale industry. Another called her the most emotionally honest pianist of her generation. Not everyone was convinced, of course. Some people still looked down on her for her lack of formal training. Some people whispered that she was all feeling and no technique, that she would never be a real artist. But more and more, people were starting to listen. Then one morning, Lucia opened her email and found an invitation that made her heart stop. It was from the International Piano Summit in New York City, the most prestigious piano event in the world. The greatest pianists on earth performed there. Careers were made and destroyed on that stage, and they wanted her. She read the email 5 times to make sure she wasn't dreaming. Then she saw something that made her blood run cold. The headline performer, The star of the entire event was Vincent Ashford. Lucia sat very still for a long time. She thought about that day in the conservatory. The laughter. The humiliation. The way she had cried alone in her car. She thought about everything she had gone through since then. All the nights of practice, all the small victories, all the moments when she had wanted to quit and hadn't. She picked up the phone and called Helena. "I got invited to the summit," she said. "Vincent Ashford is performing." There was a pause on the other end of the line. Then Helena spoke, her voice calm and certain. "Good," she said. "It's time." The week before the summit was the longest week of Lucia's life. She barely slept. She barely ate. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw Vincent Ashford's face, heard his dismissive laugh echoing in her ears. Part of her wanted to call the organizers and cancel. Part of her wanted to run away and never look back. But every time she felt like giving up, she thought of her grandmother. She thought of Helena. She thought of all the people who had stopped to listen to her in subway stations and nursing homes, all the strangers who had sent her messages saying her music had touched their hearts. She couldn't let them down. She couldn't let herself down. Helena came to visit her the night before she left for New York. They sat together in Lucia's tiny apartment, drinking tea and not saying much. Finally, Helena broke the silence. "You're not going there to prove anything to him," she said quietly. "You know that, right?" Lucia looked at her, confused. "Then why am I going?" Helena reached over and took her hand. "You're going for that girl who walked out of the masterclass in tears. You're going to show her what she became. You're going to finish what she started." Lucia felt tears prick her eyes. She nodded slowly. "Play for her," Helena said. "Play for your grandmother. Play for everyone who was ever told they weren't good enough. Forget about Vincent Ashford. He doesn't matter. The only thing that matters is the music." The next morning, Lucia boarded a plane for the first time in her life. She sat in a window seat and watched the clouds drift by beneath her, feeling like she was traveling to another world. In a way, she was. New York City was overwhelming. The buildings were taller than anything she had ever seen. The streets were packed with people rushing in every direction, all of them seeming to know exactly where they were going. Lucia felt small and out of place, like a single drop of water in an endless ocean. The concert hall where the summit was being held was even more intimidating. It was a massive building with soaring ceilings and velvet curtains and golden chandeliers that sparkled like stars. Lucia stood in the lobby, clutching her bag, trying not to look as terrified as she felt. Everywhere she looked, there were famous faces. Pianists she had watched online for years were walking past her like it was just another ordinary day. Critics and journalists huddled in corners, whispering and taking notes. Everyone seemed to belong except her. She found her way backstage and was shown to a small dressing room. It was simple and plain. Nothing like she had imagined. There was a mirror, a chair, and a small table with a bottle of water. She sat down and stared at her reflection. The woman looking back at her seemed like a stranger. A knock on the door made her jump. A stagehand poked his head in and told her the show would begin in 1 hour. Vincent Ashford would perform first. Then there would be a short intermission, and then it would be her turn. 1 hour. 60 minutes. 3,600 seconds. Lucia closed her eyes and tried to breathe. She could hear the audience filling the hall through the thin walls. Thousands of people, the most important people in the classical music world, all gathered in one place, and soon, they would all be watching her. When it was almost time for the show to start, Lucia made her way to the side of the stage. She stood in the shadows, hidden behind the curtain, and watched as Vincent Ashford walked out to thunderous applause. He looked exactly the same as she remembered. Tall, elegant, perfectly confident. He moved across the stage like he owned it, like he had never doubted himself for a single moment in his entire life. He sat down at the grand piano, adjusted his sleeves, and began to play. Lucia had to admit, he was brilliant. His technique was flawless. Every note was precise. Every phrase perfectly shaped. The audience sat in absolute silence, mesmerized by his skill. When he finished, they erupted in applause that seemed to shake the walls. Vincent stood and bowed gracefully, accepting the admiration as if it were his birthright. Then he walked off stage, passing right by the spot where Lucia was standing. He glanced at her casually, the way you might glance at a stranger on the street. "Good luck out there," he said, his voice polite but distant. Tough crowd to follow. He didn't recognize her. After everything, after that moment that had nearly destroyed her, he didn't even remember her face. Lucia said nothing. She just watched him walk away, disappearing down the corridor toward his dressing room. For a moment, she felt the old anger rising in her chest. But then something strange happened. The anger faded, replaced by something else. Something that felt almost like peace. He didn't matter. Helena was right. This wasn't about him anymore. It was never really about him. The stagehand appeared at her side. "You're on," he whispered. Lucia took a deep breath. She stepped out of the shadows and walked onto the stage. The spotlight hit her like a wave of heat. The audience was a sea of faces stretching back into darkness, 10,000 people waiting in silence. The grand piano sat in the center of the stage, gleaming under the lights. It was the most beautiful instrument she had ever seen, even more beautiful than Helena's. She walked to the bench and sat down. The seat was cold. Her hands were trembling. She could hear her own heartbeat pounding in her ears. For a moment, she couldn't move. The fear was overwhelming. She thought of all the things that could go wrong, all the ways she could fail, all the people who were waiting for her to prove that she didn't belong here. Then she thought of her grandmother. She remembered those afternoons in the tiny apartment. The smell of hot chocolate, the sound of her grandmother's voice counting out the rhythm. She remembered the creaky bench they used to share, their shoulders touching as they played together. She remembered the note on the nightstand. "Never stop playing, my darling." Lucia placed her hands on the keys. She was going to play her own composition tonight. It was a piece she had written herself, something that had poured out of her during those long months of training with Helena. She called it Manos de mi abuela, my grandmother's hands. She began to play. The first notes were soft, almost hesitant, like a memory trying to surface. They floated through the concert hall, gentle and fragile. Then, slowly, the music began to build. It grew stronger, more confident, weaving between grief and joy, between loss and hope. Lucia closed her eyes and let herself disappear into the music. She wasn't on a stage anymore. She was back in that tiny apartment, sitting next to her grandmother, feeling the warmth of her presence. She was in the subway station, playing for strangers who stopped to listen. She was in Helena's house, learning to believe in herself again. Every moment of her life flowed through her fingers into the keys. Every struggle, every tear, every small victory. The music told her story without words, speaking directly to the hearts of everyone who listened. When she played the final note, there was complete silence. Lucia opened her eyes. For a terrible moment, she thought she had failed. She thought the audience was sitting in shocked disappointment, waiting for her to leave so they could forget she had ever been there. Then someone stood up. Then another person. Then another. The applause started slowly, like distant thunder. And then it built into something enormous. The entire audience was on their feet, clapping and cheering and crying openly. 10,000 people, the most important people in the classical music world, giving her a standing ovation that seemed to go on forever. Lucia sat at the piano, tears streaming down her face, unable to move. Backstage, hidden in the shadows, Vincent Ashford watched the monitors with an expression no one had ever seen on his face before. His hands were shaking. The applause lasted for nearly 5 minutes. Lucia lost count of how many times she stood up and bowed, how many times she wiped the tears from her cheeks. The audience wouldn't stop. Every time she thought it was over, another wave of clapping would rise up from the crowd. People were shouting her name. Some were holding up their phones, recording the moment. Others were just standing there with tears running down their faces. When she finally walked off stage, her legs were shaking so badly she could barely stay upright. A stagehand guided her back to her dressing room, and she collapsed into the chair, staring at herself in the mirror. The woman looking back at her was the same one who had arrived a few hours ago, but somehow everything was different now. She had done it. She had actually done it. Her phone was already buzzing with messages. Helena had sent a single text. "Your grandmother would be so proud." Lucia pressed the phone against her heart and closed her eyes. A soft knock on the door made her look up. "Come in," she said, expecting another stagehand or maybe a journalist wanting an interview. The door opened slowly. And there, standing in the doorway, was Vincent Ashford. Lucia's breath caught in her throat. For a moment, neither of them spoke. He looked different than he had on stage. Smaller, somehow. The confidence that had always surrounded him like armor seemed to have cracked. His shoulders were slumped, and his eyes wouldn't quite meet hers. "May I come in?" he asked quietly. Lucia nodded, not trusting herself to speak. Vincent stepped inside and closed the door behind him. He stood there for a long moment, his hands clasped in front of him like a child called to the principal's office. Finally, he spoke. "I remember you," he said. His voice was barely above a whisper. "The masterclass, 3 years ago." Lucia felt her heart begin to pound. She had imagined this moment so many times. In her fantasies, she had always said something clever and cutting. Something that would make him feel exactly as small as he had made her feel. But now that he was actually standing in front of her, the words wouldn't come. "I laughed at you," Vincent continued. His voice cracked slightly. "I told you that you played like someone who learned in a garage. I dismissed you in front of everyone like you were nothing." He finally raised his eyes to meet hers. They were red and wet. "I'm sorry," he said. "I'm so deeply sorry." Lucia stared at him. She had expected many things from this moment, but not this. Not genuine remorse. Not tears. "I've been playing piano for 40 years, Vincent went on. "I've performed in the greatest concert halls in the world. I've won every award there is to win. And tonight, watching you on that stage, I realized something terrible about myself." He paused, swallowing hard. "I forgot why I started playing in the first place. Somewhere along the way, it stopped being about the music and started being about the applause, the recognition, the feeling of being better than everyone else. I became so obsessed with technique that I lost the thing that actually matters." He shook his head slowly. "What you did out there tonight, I've never been able to do that. Not once in 40 years. You made 10,000 people feel something real. You opened your heart and let them see inside. That takes more courage than anything I've ever done." Lucia sat very still, listening. The anger she had carried for so long was still there. But it felt different now. It felt tired. It felt ready to rest. "I spent 3 years hating you," she said finally. Her voice was calm, steady. "That night after the masterclass, I almost quit forever. I sat in my car and cried for hours. I thought about throwing away my keyboard and never touching a piano again." Vincent flinched like she had slapped him. "But I didn't quit," Lucia continued. "And I think, in a strange way, I have to thank you for that. Your cruelty lit a fire in me. It made me work harder than I ever would have worked otherwise. It made me determined to prove that I belonged, even when no one believed in me." She stood up from her chair and walked toward him. They were standing just a few feet apart now. "My grandmother used to say that music isn't about proving you're the best," Lucia said. "It's about making people feel less alone. For a long time, I forgot that too. I was so focused on getting revenge, on showing you that you were wrong about me, that I almost lost sight of what really matters." She took a deep breath. "But I don't want to hate you anymore. I don't want to carry that weight. What you did was wrong, and it hurt me deeply. But holding on to that pain isn't going to heal anything. It's just going to keep both of us stuck in the past." Vincent's eyes filled with fresh tears. "I don't deserve your forgiveness," he said. "Maybe not," Lucia replied. "But I'm not doing it for you. I'm doing it for me. I'm doing it for that girl who cried in her car 3 years ago. She deserves to be free." For a long moment, they just stood there. Two people who had been connected by a moment of cruelty. and were now connected by something else entirely. Then, Lucia said something that surprised even herself. Maybe we could play together sometime. I could learn from your technique, and maybe you could remember why you started. Vincent looked at her like she had offered him a lifeline, like she had given him something he didn't know he needed. I would like that, he said softly. I would like that very much. 6 months later, they performed a duet at Carnegie Hall. It was a piece they had composed together, blending Vincent's technical precision with Lucia's emotional depth. They called it Second Chances. The night of the performance, the concert hall was packed. Critics who had followed both of their careers sat in the front rows, notebooks ready. Backstage, Lucia and Vincent stood side by side, waiting for their cue. Nervous? Lucia asked. Vincent smiled. It was a real smile, the first genuine one she had ever seen from him. Terrified, he admitted. But the good kind of terrified. Lucia nodded. She understood exactly what he meant. They walked out onto the stage together. The audience applauded, but it was different this time. There was curiosity in the air, a sense that something unexpected was about to happen. They sat down at the piano, side by side on the bench. For a moment, Lucia was transported back to her childhood, sitting next to her grandmother in their tiny apartment, their shoulders touching as they played. She looked at Vincent. He looked at her. And then, they began to play. The music that filled Carnegie Hall that night was unlike anything anyone had ever heard. It was technical and emotional, precise and wild, disciplined and free. It was two people who had hurt each other finding a way to create something beautiful together. When they finished, the audience sat in stunned silence. Then the applause began, even louder than before. Lucia closed her eyes and let the sound wash over her. She thought of her grandmother, of Helena, of everyone who had believed in her when she couldn't believe in herself. She thought of the girl who had walked out of that masterclass in tears, convinced that her dreams were over. Look at you now, she whispered to that girl in her mind. Look at what you became. Later that night, after the interviews and the photographs and the congratulations, Lucia went back to her hotel room and sat by the window. The New York City skyline glittered in the darkness, millions of lights stretching out to the horizon. She pulled out her phone and looked at the photo she kept as her wallpaper. It was an old picture, faded and worn, of her grandmother sitting at their broken upright piano in that cramped apartment. She was smiling, her hands resting gently on the keys. I did it, abuela, Lucia whispered. I never stopped playing. And my music changed everything. Somewhere out there, beyond the lights and the noise and the endless city, she could almost hear her grandmother's voice. I always knew you would, my darling. I always knew.